Hey guys, real quick before we begin, I just want to let you know that I measure my success in students taught and not dollars earned. So when you get to the end of this video, please let me know if you've learned anything. The preferred method is dropping a comment, but I accept likes and subs as well. It keeps me motivated. If you have a topic you'd like me to cover, let me know by leaving me a comment. And with that out of the way, let's get started. In this video, we will learn how to navigate within the 3D viewport editor. I'll be going over a lot of preferences so you can dial in how 3D navigation works so it feels comfortable to you. Although this guide is intended for complete beginners, adjusting the preferences will help 3D veterans coming from other 3D applications transition smoothly into Blender. Before we get into it, let me set up the workspace so we can view the preferences so it's not floating around in a separate window. While I'm doing that, I'll have you note that everything we're going over can be found in the View menu under Viewpoint and Navigation. This guide assumes you have a keyboard with a numpad and a mouse with 3 buttons. If you don't have a numpad, you can emulate one by going to Edit, Preferences, Input, and under Keyboard, turn on Emulate Numpad. This will let you use the numbers at the top of the keyboard as shortcuts. Just be mindful that this will remove their original functionality. If your mouse doesn't have a middle mouse button, which is usually the scroll wheel pressed in, then you'll need to emulate one by going to the Mouse tab and turning on Emulate 3-button mouse. This makes it so you can use the middle mouse button by pressing Alt left mouse button. Here's a quick summary of what we'll be going over today. Orbiting, zooming, panning, what to do when you get lost. The navigation gizmo is this little thing in the upper right corner. If yours is not there, you can turn it on by going to Viewport Gizmos and checking navigation. This top ball is called the Orbit gizmo, and it has 6 preset viewport buttons you can click corresponding to the positive and negative directions of each axis. If you click on one of them, it'll snap your camera to that view and automatically switch your camera from a perspective view to an orthographic view. You can click it again in the center to have it switch you to the opposite side. The shortcuts for these are 1, 3, and 7 on the numpad. That'll switch you to the front, right, or top view. If you hold down Control and press the same buttons, it'll switch you to the back, left, or bottom view. If you don't want it to automatically switch the camera between perspective and orthographic, you can disable it by going to Navigation and unchecking Perspective. Then when you go to or leave a preset view, it'll keep the camera in whatever type it currently has. So if you want to keep the perspective camera, make sure it's already in perspective. If you don't like how fast it snaps to the different views, you can adjust that by changing the smooth view value. It's in milliseconds and ranges from 0 to 1000. 0 will disable it and 1000 will make it take exactly 1 second to do the transition. Just note that smooth view will affect all transitions. Here's a pro tip: if you want to reset a value back to its default value, just hover your mouse over the value and press backspace. You could also use your right mouse button on it and click Reset to Default Value. Going back to the Orbit gizmo, you can left mouse button drag to orbit around. The shortcut for orbiting is middle mouse button drag. So we can either left mouse button drag on the orbit ball or middle mouse button and drag anywhere within the scene. If you're coming from another 3D application and you just can't wrap your head around Blender's navigation shortcuts, you can change this in preferences by going to Key Map and change this drop-down menu from Blender to Industry Compatible. I think most Blender tutorials keep it on Blender so everyone can be on the same page, but once you're comfortable and you don't need YouTube tutorials anymore, I highly recommend you switch over. Getting back, there are a few things you need to know about orbiting. There's an imaginary pivot point that it orbits around. It takes a little getting used to, but you'll eventually just know where it is. Sometimes it'll be really close to your camera and it'll give you all sorts of problems. When this happens, select an object and press period on the numpad. This will set the orbit point to the center of the object. If you don't like how fast or slow it orbits, you can adjust the sensitivity by changing the orbit sensitivity back in navigation. You can also change the orbit method from turntable to trackball. However, it's best used with an actual trackball. If you're using a mouse, just say no. You can also choose to always orbit around your current selection, which is really noticeable if the selection is far off the screen. I find it sometimes acts weird when orbiting from an orthographic view, so I'll just keep that off. This magnifying glass is the zoom button. To use it, drag with the left mouse button up or down to zoom in or out. The shortcut for zooming is dragging with the Control middle mouse button held down. You can also use your mouse wheel or the plus or minus keys on the numpad. It zooms based on how close you are to the orbit pivot point. If we zoom all the way in, you'll notice we stop. That's because we're pressing up against the orbit pivot point. Now if I release the middle mouse button and try to zoom out, you'll notice that it's a lot of work. The camera barely moves at all. Why this is can be a little tricky to explain, so I'll explain it with an industry standard teaching tool, Microsoft Paint. Say you have an orbit pivot point and your camera is some distance away. This distance is what I call the scaling factor. Your mouse movement gets multiplied by this scaling factor when Blender calculates how far to move the camera. When your camera is very close to the orbit pivot point, this scaling factor is very small, so you have to move your mouse a lot to get any noticeable movement. On the other hand, if we were very far away, the scaling factor is very big, and small movements with your mouse will result in large camera movements. The scaling factor is updated every time you release your mouse. This is important to note in case you're really close or really far and you want to get a more reasonable scaling factor. Just get close and it'll get easier to get a better one next time. Or just select what you're trying to work on and press period on the numpad. There are a few different methods of zooming. The default is dolly, which means it physically moves the camera in or out. We're not actually zooming with the lens. There's also continue, where moving up and down will increase or decrease the zoom in or out speed. Notice how my mouse isn't moving, but I'm still zooming. Dolly and continue both have an option called zoom to mouse position, and all that does is make the camera zoom to where you click on screen instead of zoom into the orbit pivot point. Scale will zoom just like how you're used to zooming using a smartphone, where the center acts like a finger and your cursor acts like the other finger. Pulling them apart zooms in, pinching them together zooms out, you just can't rotate. If you want to invert the zoom direction, there are options for that too, and the Blender guides were nice enough to separate it between the mouse and wheel, but that depends on the zoom method. It's also possible to zoom in or out on a region using Zoom Region. This can be found in the View menu under Navigation, Zoom Region. The shortcut is Shift-B. To use it, left mouse button drag over an area you want to zoom in on. You can also zoom out by middle mouse button dragging. If you try to zoom over an empty area, you'll get a depth too large error. The final button we'll go over is panning. Left mouse button drag to move your camera up, down, left, or right. The shortcut for panning is Shift middle mouse button drag. The distance it moves is also based on the scaling factor, so it'll look like it's not working if you're too close, or you'll go all over the place if you're too far. As far as I could tell, there are no options for panning. It's not that uncommon to get completely lost in a 3D scene. Accidentally zooming too far out, followed by panning your orbit pivot point millions of light years across 3D space is entirely possible, especially when you're just starting out. Luckily, there are a few options. If you have an object selected, you can press period on the numpad. This will bring the camera to the object. If you're unlucky and don't have something selected, you can press the home key. This will center your camera around all the objects in your scene. If you don't have any objects in your scene, then the home key won't work. And if your 3D cursor is out in the middle of nowhere, then even adding new objects won't help either, since they'll be placed at the 3D cursor. Given your current situation, it's best just to start a new scene. Well guys, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've learned something new. Subscribe to follow me on this Blender journey and have a good one. Bye guys.